So how do we know this to be the case? Amarava damarka alkena Yehudim aprasim bayoshim ba'ari aprazos korim biyom arba'asar lachodesh adar midepradim baraba'asar mukafin bechamisha asar. So ve'ema maybe prasim baraba'asar mukafin klal kala. Maybe those who are remarkable have in mina that the people who dwell in cities that are surrounded by walls will not read the Megillah. So the Gemara responds with two questions. First of all, Lav Yisrael Ninhu, I want to dwell on that. And Ve'od mehodevad kushksiv. Everybody in the empire, right, no matter where they were living, would be involved in this miracle and therefore would have to read the Megillah. So the Gemara's line, that rhetorical question, Lav Yisrael Ninhu, what are they not members of the Jewish people, highlights this idea that Kriyas HaMegillah is really a referendum on one's belonging to Am Yisrael. We talk about Afhen Hayu Ba'os Hanes, Afhen Hayu Ba'oso Safek. Everybody was threatened with destruction, and those of us in the Rambam Chabur in the morning know that this is why, even though normally Nashim and Avadim Kananiyim have the same set of halachos, it wouldn't make sense that an Evet Kanani would be obligated in Megillah, because they're not part of Yisrael. The Rambam's formulation, Yatzum Bichlal Akum, Ulechal Yisrael Lo Higiyu, that they're in an intermediate status. So that's this line in the Gemara, V'lav Yisrael Ninhu, are they not members of the Jewish people if they dwell in a walled city? The rhetorical question, they obviously are. V'od mehodu v'ad kush ksiv. So then the Gemara says, V'ema prazim ba'arbeisar mukafin ba'arbeisar v'chameisar, that those who are in Mukaf Choma will be able to read both on the 14th and the 15th. K'dichsiv liosos yemes yom arba'asar l'chodesh adar v'eis yom chamisha asar bo b'chol shana. So the Gemara responds, Yival kasev es yom arba'asar v'chamisha asar kidika amar. That would imply that there is some flexibility. Hash dichsiv es yom arba'asar v'es yom chamisha asar asa es upasek. The additional word es actually draws a hard line and says the 14th and the 15th are to be separated. The prazim on the 14th and the krachim ukafim chom on the 15th. Hani berabasar v'hani b'chamisha asar. Ve'ema prazim b'arbeisar b'kafin ibo b'arbeisar ibo b'chamesar. So you could still say that the prazim will read on the 14th. That's explicit in the text. And because the mukafin aren't explicit in the text, so they get to choose. And they have to stick to the date that they choose. They have to stick to the 14th or to the 15th. So Amar Kra bizmanehem, as we saw yesterday, Zmano Sholzeh, Lo Zmano Sholzeh, that they do not have the same dates. So Ve'ema B'tzleisar, again, so maybe the Krachim Ukavim Choma should read the day before. After all, the 13th is Zman Kihila Lakolhi. What did Rashi say about Zman Kihila Lakolhi? Rashi says it was the day of the great military victory, the great day of the great miracle. And the Bali Atosvos, right, the Kodan Agonis Maimunios and the Shiltos say Yud Gimel Zman Kihila Lakolhi is a reference to Tanis Esther. Remember, and we spoke this morning a little bit, some of us, about the idea that Rashi's version of the Megillah, if it's Muvan Me'elav, that you'd be able to read the Megillah on the 13th because it's a Yom Nes, that aligns with we're going to get to the Gemara in Daf Daled, the fact that Kriyas HaMegillah is a form of Zemer, is a form of Halal, Kriyas Zo Hilula. You're giving praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the miracle. But if Zman Kila Lakolhi means a day of Tainus, that certainly accords with the view that we found on Daf Daled, Yom HaMekra V'losana V'layla V'lo Dumya Li, the element of the Megillah, which is really a very plaintive tale about the vulnerability of Am Yisrael. Okay. So Zmano Sholzeh, Lo Kizmano Sholzeh, Ve'ema B'tzleisar, Kishushan. So it can't be the 13th because remember, like the Jews in Shushan were fighting on the 13th and on the 14th, so everything should be based on Shushan. Eshkachin Asiya, so that's as far as the performance of the mitzvos hayom. Zechira minala, and how do we know that this applies to reading the Megillah? We're going to talk a lot about this, these two dimensions of Purim. There's the Asiya, there's the mitzvos hayom, there's the Su'uda, there's Mishloach Manos, there's Matanos Avyonim. Zechira is the reading of the Megillah. Amar Kra, Hayamim Ha'ela Nizkarim V'na'asim. This is one of the most important and foundational lines of the Gemara. Iskish Zechira La'asira. So the Zechira and Asiya go together. Reading the Megillah is not separate and apart from the mitzvos hayom. Okay. Masisin deloki aitana. Detani Rabbi Shimon Karcha Omer. Krachan mukafin choma mimos achashverosh karin bechamisha sar. That when do we measure krachin mukafin choma? From which historical period? Very logical. Days of Achashverosh. So my time with the Rabbi Shimon Karcha Kishushan. My Shushan mukafis choma mimos achashverosh. That Achashverosh is actually responsible for that. Very fascinating. V'karin bechamisha sar. If the idea is that Shushan is a walled city and therefore all walled cities should follow Shushan, which is like not an obvious thing. You could have said that it was only Shushan that should read on the 15th. But if Shushan is a walled city and its wall traces back to Achashverosh itself, so that should be the historical point of demarcation. That's a very fascinating idea. And I would say an intuitive one. So Tana Didan my Taima. So what's the basis of our Tana? So the Gemara says it's based on Gzera Shava. Yalif Prazi Prazi. Ksiv Hachal Kena Yehudim HaPrazim. In the Megillah it says that the Jews of the open cities read on the 14th. Uksiv Hasam says in Sefer Yehoshua Levad Me'arei HaPrazi Harbe Ma'od, that they didn't capture some of the open cities. Ma'alahalan Mimos Yoshua Ben Nun Avkan Mimos Yoshua Ben Nun. Bishlam Rabbi Yoshua Ben Korach Lomar Ketana Didan Delay Slay Prazi Prazi. He doesn't hold of this Gzera Shava. Ela Tana Didan my time Lomar Rabbi Yoshua Ben Korach. So our Tana, why doesn't he hold like Rabbi Yeshua ben Korach? My time, Daha Islay Prazi Prazi, because he does have the Gzera Shava. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what I meant. Hachi Kamar, Shushan Da'avad Kiman, Lo Kiprazim, Vilo Kimukafin. Shushan, right, could have been very different, right? The Shushan, after all, was sui generis. It was the only place in the entire kingdom of Achashverosh that continued to fight in the 14th. So Amarava, Shiny Shushan Hoel V'Naase Banes. Okay, that Shushan could have been, halachically speaking, totally different than everything else, since it was the seat of the miracle. Bishlam Latani Didan, Haidu Dechsev Medina Medina Ir Va'ir Medina Medina Lachalik Ben Mukafin Choma Myosi Yoshua Ben Nun, the Mukafis Choma Moshe Achashverosh, Ir Va'ir Nami Lachalik Ben Shushan L'Shara Ayaros, Ella, the Rabbi Yeshua Ben Korcha, Bishlam Medina Medina Lachalik Bein Shushan l'shara rayos ela ir va'ir l'may asa. What distinction is drawn by that pasuk? Amr l'char Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha l'tana didan minicha. Even if I don't have a good answer for what that clause would mean, does the Tana of our Mishnah, again, who says Mimos Yoshua ben Nun, have a good answer? Kevan de islay prazi prazi medina medina lamali. Why should there be that clause either? Ela kra l'drasha hu da'asa uch Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi hu da'asa d'amr Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi krach v'chol hasamuchlo v'chol hanira imo nidon kikrach. A very important halacha, that when we talk about krach and mukavin choma mimos Yoshua ben Nun, so we're talking about not just the walled city, but v'chol hasamuchlo v'chol hanira imo. A very beautiful concept in the Gemara. And we're not just talking about the walled city itself, but the satellites that are associated with that walled city. And the satellites as defined in two disparate ways. So we say kol hasamuch v'chol hanira. So what are the two ways of connecting to the major city, Avi? Either through the medium of distance. Okay, very good. So it could be just geographically close, even if it's in a valley, you can't necessarily see it, or so eyesight. So the halacha recognizes here two versions of a connection: either geographic connection. So if it's close enough, we'll define how close it is. It's like a krach. They're going to read on the 15th. It's always a very practical halachic issue in Yerushalayim. How far out into the suburbs of Yerushalayim as the city and the municipality continues to expand is considered reading on the 15th. Let's say you're in remote. There are some sfeikos about neighborhoods in Yerushalayim. Is it considered samuch? Is it not considered samuch? So nira and samuch. This is such an interesting halachic construct, Daniel. That the halachic mentality is that if you can see something from somewhere, so that establishes a halachic connection, or if it's within a certain geographic distance. So let's discuss exactly what that is. So ad kama Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Yisem Rabbi Chia bar Amma kimei Chamasan l'Tveria. The distance between this place called Chamas and Tveria, mil. Mil is how many amos? 2,000 amos. No, that's right. This week's Sedra, we have the halacha of Tchum Shabbos. So Tchum Shabbos midaraisa is Shlosha Parsa, which is 12 meal. Parsa is 4 meal. 3 parsas, therefore 12 meal, 24,000 amos. But midarabanan Tchum Shabbos, you can't leave the city more than 2,000 amos. It's the same halacha. 2,000 amos is like the universally recognized halachic standard for a distance, for going into a different geographic location. So in the halacha, what's considered personal space? What do we say is a person's space? Daled amos. What's considered geographically, the municipality, you always say mil. Once you're talking about a greater distance than a mil, now you've lost the connection between two spaces. There's certain, basically mathematical constructs in halacha. The Rav would talk about this a lot. Daled amos, gimel tvachim, lavud, meal. These show up again and again in halacha. So that's considered samuch. That's considered lavud. That's a good question. So we're able to say that even if in practice, like in Hilchos Sukkah or in Hilchos Erevin, if you have a gap that's 3 tvachim, let's assume the fist is a tefach, right? So we consider that space filled in. So let's say the walls of the sukkah are supposed to actually go down to the ground, because the walls in your house go down to the ground. But if it's within lavud of the ground, we can consider that to be down to the ground. Okay.
That's what like those mahadran straps thing that or something like that, right?
Well, that's actually for something else. That's so that the walls don't actually blow too much in the wind, because it has to be omed bifnei ruach mitzuya.
I heard that. I've heard that.
Then I may not be exactly sure what you're referring to. The reason that people tie down the walls is because of it has to be omed bifnei ruach mitzuya.
In addition to the walls, they act as a.
Okay, I'd have to see it, but it's entirely possible. So again, the idea of lavud is to fill something in. Basic idea here is that you find the same mathematical formulas repeating themselves in halacha. It's a thought system. So v'leima meal. So the Gemara says, so why don't you just say meal? Hakamash malan dishiura de meal kamahavi kemechamas on the tiveria. This is a very interesting point. The Gemara is saying is that people, in terms of knowing what a meal is, we're teaching you that the distance of a meal is the distance between Hamas and Tiberia. Anthropologists, some of you will go on to study anthropology in college, make the following point. In Western cultures, where we have this concept of time, the way that people set up appointments is they say, okay, we're going to have a business meeting at 3:30, or we'll meet in 5 minutes. So in Eastern cultures, they don't have that concept. They'll say, we'll meet in smoking a cigarette. What does it mean? How is that a time? Well, if it takes, 5 minutes to smoke a cigarette. They have certain associative terms. They associate 5 minutes with the amount of time it takes to smoke a cigarette. So that's what you find in various languages. So what the Gemara is saying is that if you just said meal, that might not mean very much to people. But if you said mechamas on Latveria, that had meaning. People had done that journey. They would say, oh, okay, I know how long that is. I know how. So that was associative for people. That was the known quantity. So now the Gemara is going to go on what seems like a bit of a tangent, but it's all based on this construct of Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Isema Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Isema Rabbi Chia bar Abba man sepach mem nun sadi pei chaf sofim amram. What is this man sepach? For?
The letters with the sof.
Exactly, right? So the kefalosios, mem sofit, nun sofit, right? Sadi sofit, pei sofit, chav sofit. Sofim amarim, nevi'ei hadoros. So this traces itself back to the nevi'im. So v'tizbara, does that really make sense? V'haksiv eila hamitzvos. Right, we have a pasuk, right, at the end of Parshas Bechukosai, at the end of the bris. Eila HaMitzvah, at the end of Sefer Vayikra, Eila HaMitzvos, these are the mitzvos. Only Moshe can come up with halachic constructs. She'ei Navi Rasha L'chadesh Davar Me'ata. Navi is not allowed to be Mechadeh. What do you mean, Sofim Amarim? This isn't part of Torah's Moshe Misinai, that there is a Mem Sofit, etc. Ve'od Amar Rav Chisda, Mem V'samach Shevaluchos, B'neis Hayu Omdin. If the Mem and the Samach and the Luchos B'neis Hayu Omdin, so if you take a look over at Rashi, Shahaisach Hakikasan Mishnei Avrehen, the Luchos was magical, mystical, miraculous in the sense that you could read it from both sides. Ksuvim Mishnei Avrehen. Hilkach Sharosios Leish Makom Devak, Elamem V'samach Haisa Ba'avir. Right, so the Mem and the Samach didn't have any place to sort of stick to, right, because of their circular nature. Right, V'avshari L'Latari to Rav Chisda B'stumin. Right, you might have said that it was the Mem Sasum, in other words, the Mem Sofit. V'chiyis marach Rabbi Yirmiyah b'psuchin, v'achimuch perakabona b'sach Shabbos al-parach lamilsa deshavula tarvayu. Okay, so basically, what the Gemara is driving at is this idea that the Mem, the Samach, and the Luchos, if they were b'nei sayu omdim, it points in the direction of there being at a much earlier stage in history. In Mehava Havu, they originally were. In other words, the Mansapach was established in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. V'lava Yadi Hai be'emsa teva Hai be'sof teva. V'asud sofer v'takinu psuchen be'emsa teva ustumim be'sof teva. Okay, so the Nevi'im, all they did and said, it was known that there was two versions of a Mem, two versions of a Nun, there were two versions of a Chav, two versions of a Tzadi. So what the Nevi'im came and did and said, oh, that's the Mem Sofit. And that's the open. I mean, we learned it in first grade. Your first grade teacher taught you this, but it actually took Nevi'im to establish it. It wasn't so obvious. Right? So the Gemara says, but even that is too much of a chiddush. Sof, Eila hamitzvah she'ein navi asi l'chadish davar me'ata. That how could this not have been established originally? So Ella, rather, shchachum v'chazru v'yastum. It was established in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. It was forgotten. V'chazru v'yastum. Where do we have the same formulation? Shchachum v'chazru v'yastum. Very, very important. I'm sure it'll sound very familiar to you guys. You guys all have seen this. Shlomo, where do we have that? That construct, shchachum v'chazru v'yastum? Not just by which is the mem pasuach and mem sofit, but by the most basic element of our Jewish lives, Shmona Esrei. Right, when we say that Anshe Knesset Agdola established them, so how could it say in the Gemara and Brachos that who established them? Well, who the Gemara and Brachos, it says that Rabbi Gamliel wanted to know. So maybe the story of Shmuel HaKatan and Shimon HaPkuli, that at a much later generation in Yavna, they established the Shmona Esrei, and then they established the Birkas Haminim. Shimon HaPkuli re-established the Shmona Esrei, and Shmuel HaKatan established Lam Al Shinim. So the Gemara says, I thought that the Anshe Knesset Agadola wrote all of our brachos. It goes back to the time, when Bayis Sheni was first being built. Rabbi Gamliel is after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, hundreds of years later. So the Gemara says, "Shechachum v'chazru v'yastum." The text, or the order of the text, was lost. So this is, by the way, one of the most important Gemaras that we have in terms of the halachic process. Ein navi rasha l'chadesh davar me'ata. And according to this Gemara, we have like a very expansive understanding that a navi wouldn't have been able to mechadesh even, that this mem was the mem sofit, and this mem was the mem pasuach. So since we're learning Masechas Megillah, what's going to be the dominant question? How could you establish a new holiday? And so we're going to talk about that extensively when we get to the Gemara and Dav Zayin. But it's quite ironic that this is one of the first Gemaras in Masechas Megillah. If you can't determine, what's the mem sofit and what's the mem pasuach, surely you can't start your own holiday. And the rabbis, of course, they resisted it. Yes, you had a question.
I mean, how do you understand that everyone forgot this, like such basic stuff? Like, does that, like, the entire Jewish community forget this?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, but you have to recall that there was no printing. There's a very small number of people who had access to this information. Chazar Sashatz in general, right? When literacy rates were how many people were involved in writing? Read a text. There's no concept of a sitter. There's nothing. Yeah. Oh, that's what you're going to say, right? Yeah, Avi.
I made a mistake. Wasn't there another script that was used before? Wasn't the Hebrew text?
Yes. Yeah, so there's a Ksav Ivri and Ksav Ashuri, two different texts. So we today only use Ksav Ashuri, but initially there was Ksav Ivri.
And it would have the same construct as those letters?
It would have the difference between a Pasuach and a Sasam. Yeah.
Wait, why are we trying to figure out this one mem sofit or not?
Well, just the Gemara is just quoting statements in the Amr B'Yirmiyah V'Yisema Rabbi Chia Bar Abba. So it was just because it's the same author, the Amorai Binyamin.
I understand conceptually how they could forget it, but just the idea of that it being forgotten, conveniently remembered exactly the same.
Well, I wouldn't say it's conveniently. In other words, they took Nevi'im, they had Ruach HaKodesh to reestablish it. But the Gemara's concern is a juridical concern that they can't be mechadesh something, and I wouldn't even call this a law, right? It's not a law. It's like a certain, right? It's like a fundamental.
But we couldn't say that. Well, we couldn't say that by Shemona Esrei. They weren't the Tanaim weren't the Nevi'im. We could hear.
No, it's true, right? So that's so there the actual language is. Rabbi Gamliel wanted to know if there was somebody who knew how to be misader Yudches brachos. So the Gemara says is that there was some sense of what the brachos were, but somebody who could recapitulate the order who could understand what the appropriate order would be, and then the Gemara that we're going to see will go through, what the appropriate order should be.
That doesn't sound so much as remembering as just like making a new statement. Not that that's not allowed, but it doesn't sound so much.
Right. I mean, the term the Gemara uses is very similar to what you're saying. I would agree. Is yastum. They've established it. Yeah. Okay.
First one, the sixth line.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure. I hadn't reviewed the Tosfos before. If there was something I wanted to point out. No, okay, that's fine. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yisrael Rabbi Chia bar Abba Targum Shel Torah Unklos Hager Amaram Mipi Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yeshua were chavrusa. They sort of had opposite histories. Rabbi Yeshua, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says about him Ashrei Yolado, that his mother, as is elaborated in Avos to Rabbi Nassan, when he was a little baby, would push him around in a carriage to like different batei medrash, that he should absorb Torah by osmosis. Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus, his father, was virulently anti-religious. And when Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus decided he wanted to be religious, he disowned him. So anyway, they're sort of an odd couple, Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus and Rabbi Yeshua. They became chavrusas. They had a very productive relationship, and eventually things deteriorate. That's a story of the Tanur Shel Achnai. Rabbi Yeshua says, Lo b'shamayim, and Rabbi Elazar keeps on insisting he's right, and Rabbi Elazar is, of course, right. But it doesn't really matter if you're right, because we have this concept of majority rule in halacha. So anyway, and then Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus dies when he's in Nidui. It's just the whole tragedy in Gemara Bava Metzia and Daf Nun Tes. But be that as it may, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yeshua trained Rabbi Akiva. So in addition, the Gemara is saying here, who was another trainee?
Unklos?
Right, so Unklos Hager, right, Unklos, amazing, he contributed so much to the Masora. He was a Roman aristocrat. He learned from Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yehoshua. Targum Shanavim, Yonasan Buziel Amaro, Mipi Chagai Zachariah and Malachi. Anybody remember Chagai Zachariah and Malachi? Where are they from?
Treyasar.
Right, so they were in the VA Treyasar. They were in the VA Bayasheni. And Yonasan ben Uziel, he was a Talmud of
Them three.
of Hillel, right? Remember the Gemara Masech Sutta Daf
he was
Tavches?
he was the...
That when he would daven or learn that a bird that was flying overhead would be nuked. So so he had this Masora that was inherited, going back to Chagai Zachariah Malachi. And his das Eretz Yisrael Arba Meos Parsa, but his commentary was so revealing that Eretz Yisrael shook in this way. Yatsa Sabas Kol V'Amra Miuzeh Shegila Sisarai Liv Nayadim, because there's a lot of things in Nevi'im, especially when you get to Nevi'im Achronim, that reference Yemos HaMashiach. So Kadosh Baruch Hu reacted in saying, who's spilling all the beans? Amad Yonasan ben Uziel al Raglav V'Amar Anihu Shegilisi Sarecha Liv Nayadam. I didn't do it for my own sake and not for the prestige of my family. I gave a definitive targum, so there shouldn't be a machlokas about what these psukim mean. But that would have been too revealing. My timer. Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu prevent Yonasan ben Uziel from doing a targum nexuvim? Mishum de isbe kates Mashiach. Okay. Because it contains the Kates Mashiach. The Kadosh Baruch Hu didn't want it revealed when it was that Mashiach was coming. You have to understand, people who spend all the time with their Bible codes and trying to figure out when Mashiach is coming. If Kadosh Baruch Hu wanted us to know when Mashiach was coming, He would have told us when Mashiach was coming. We're supposed to focus on what we're doing right now, which is learning Torah. Doing chesed and davening and the fundamentals. You want to be a good basketball player. You practice your free throws. You practice your layups. You practice your dribbling and your passing. A way not to become a very good basketball player is to spend all your time at practice taking half-court shots. That's basically what this Gemara means, is that Kadosh Baruch Hu, he'll determine when the appropriate time is for Mashiach to come. And Yonasan ben Uziel, he didn't want him to reveal that. Livnei Adam. Just in terms of the most important points to review is Mano Shel Zeh Lo Zmano Shel Zeh, that you have the difference in Krachim and Mukafim Choma are always the 15th, and the Ayaros HaGedolim and the Kfarim we know are either the 14th, the Kfarim Maktim Liyam Maknisa. We discussed it yesterday, either for their own sake, that we don't even matriach them to come in to the big city twice, or Kedei L'Sapek Mazon Mayim Mazon Lachem Shebe Ayaros, that they should be able to take care of people. We said it's not just krach, but I really like this Gemara, as you could tell. It's krach v'chol asamachlo v'chol hanira, that there's this halacha construct of the expanded greater metropolitan area. And then once we got into that statement of Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Yisem Rabbi Chia bar Amba, so we talked about mansapach tzofim amarum. So how could that be? Ein navi rasha l'chadish davar me'ata. Okay, so it wasn't new. They just, that which had been forgotten, they restored. And right now where we're holding is Targum HaTorah is the Unkel Sager, Mipi Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yeshua. Yonasan ben Uziel happened to be a Talmud of Hillel HaZake, and so he had Masara from Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, or Nevi'im, the proper way to give Targum of Navi. God wasn't thrilled with that, but God only put his foot down when it came to Ksuvim. One of the questions that we're going to have to answer, Ein Navi Rasha L'Chadish Davar Me'ata, so how exactly do you have Masechas Megillah? Okay. God willing, we'll pick it up there tomorrow. If for whatever reason, Rabbi Adler made an announcement on the loudspeaker before that, he'll be davening for snow, in which case I don't see how Kadosh Baruch Hu can stand up to Rabbi Adler.
It's very nice outside. It's like 60
if we're here, then we're here, and if we're home, so I'll just put a message on Schoology, see if and when people are available. We'll do a FaceTime or Skype. We'll figure out a way. Okay. Very good. Okay, I will be back in 1 minute.